Thanks for being with us today, everybody, to talk a little bit about the intersections of justice work and history, and how we might start to understand the one as the other. My name is Braden Paynter. I'm the Director of Methodology and Practice at the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience. For those of you who haven't run across us before, we are a network of museums, historic sites, places of memory around the world. We've got more than 300 members in more than 65 countries around the world, all of whom come together with the belief that our historic sites have critical roles to play in helping us build more just and humane futures. And I see a number of our wonderful members on the call already, Beth and Krista, and maybe more. There's more names than I can read this quickly. And one of the best parts for me about being part of the coalition is that you get to be in connection with amazing people everywhere, right, who want to come together to do this, like Jaime. Jaime, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi there. My name is Jaime Arsenault, and I'm the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the White Earth Band in Minnesota. And yeah, we're one of the groups that get to work with Braden, and so it's a really wonderful thing, really wonderful connection. For the Chippewa office at White Earth, our goal really is to locate and protect and preserve White Earth cultural resources and heritage, and traditional practices, natural resources, so that all of these things are available for the community members for future generations to come. And so that's the big, I guess, responsibility for my office. And White Earth is one of the largest reservations in the state of Minnesota. It also has some of the poorest counties, depending on which year you pull data from, for the state of Minnesota. So there's a large number of tribal members there, and then there are also a large number of tribal members that have gone to live in urban areas such as Minneapolis or California or the East Coast. And so people are kind of spread out. And so my responsibility is also to make sure that they can access this information too. Thank you.
And kind of what we're going to do is we're going to let people get into small groups for just a moment to get to know each other. Because again, justice work is very much about building a world, but it is also going to come with contestations of power. There's no version of justice work where we're not challenging existing power structures. And challenging existing power structures means we need allies, we need solidarity, we need relationships that are going to help us make that change. So we're going to get into some small groups in a second, get a chance to meet other people who are thinking about this, and try and learn from each other a little bit. Then we'll give you a couple of definitions of justice, a couple of different operating definitions that we see around here, as part of helping us understand what might be going on in our own heads, trying to make that explicit, and then be able to make choices about how we want to move forward. And then the last thing, we'll kind of shift over, and Jamie's going to do a bunch of storytelling around some of the work they've been doing, which is amazing stuff. So that's kind of, then we'll have a big chat at the end. So that's kind of the flow as we're going to do this. So right now, we're going to drop into some breakout rooms. And this is the part where I got to do division in my head. And that's not a super successful thing for anybody. So we'll give this a go here. That would be, let's see. I think that's a good division number. All right, small groups opening up. We hope you all are able to jump in and chat with each other. And we'll come back in about 5 minutes. Go ahead and introduce yourselves and what brings you to this work today. Hey, and Morgan, Do you happen to have the feed loop link this for this conversation so that we could be watching the chat box from there simultaneously?
Yep, I will put it in the chat.
Thank you. Right, and for everybody who's still in the main room here, how are we doing on, is there anything we can do to help you get to your small breakout rooms? Questions anybody has?
Hi, Braden. This is Kristen. I
Kristen?
think so. You're going to see two of a lot of people because if people are in through both, you're going to see two, which is tricky. But I switched to Zoom right as you were assigning breakout rooms. So I think I probably got assigned one through FeedLoop, but now I'm on Zoom and I don't have one. So you can just plop me in wherever.
Sure. There we go. You're in.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for telling us that's what's happening. bring everybody back in a moment. All right, welcome back, everybody. Thanks for hanging in there through the difficulty of bouncing from feed loop to Zoom and back again. And to everyone who was in a room alone for a little bit, thanks for being reflective and thoughtful by yourself for a minute or two. To everybody who jumped platforms, thanks for doing that and trying to make this happen. As we're all starting to figure our way through this, we'll do some more breakout rooms in just a little bit. So hopefully it'll go a little bit smoother the next time. We are going to do some small breakout rooms again to be thinking about how these things work and apply in our own lives. So if folks haven't clicked through to the Zoom yet, we'd encourage you to start to do that now so we can be set up for just a few minutes from now. As we do so, sharing either on the feed loop email or chat thread or in the Zoom chat thread, what are some of the things that are coming up for people? What are the things on your mind as you come to a session today about the intersection of history and justice?
Sorry, Braden, can you ask that again?
Sure. As you come and join a session today, of all the things you could have done with your time, you chose to join a session on the intersection of history and justice. What are you carrying with you that led you to do that?
Yeah, so I don't mind going ahead and answering. So Priya Chaya, I am the Associate Director of Content at the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And what I'm bringing with me is trying to hear as many voices as possible about how we can change the way we talk about preservation, change the way we tell our stories about preservation, and how we can work with communities to tell their story. So not be the people doing the telling for them, but opening up the space and allowing them a platform in which to tell their stories. So that's what I am bringing with me.
Thank you, and thanks for sharing that. Seeing in the chat box, folks talking about lynching and truth and reconciliation there, Native American history. John says, somebody said reconciliation and recognizing our own limits. Yeah, right. Lots of big pieces that people are talking about. Yeah. Right. Already starting to introduce a couple of the different power structures that we might be struggling with. People starting to talk about what some of the ways that we challenge those are, right? Whether that's through truth telling, multiple voices, power sharing, right? Reconciliation and memorialization. Absolutely. Stereotypes and a university reckoning with its history and racism. Yeah. The emotional labor needed to do this. Oh, Yeah, thank you for talking about that. For sure. Just to the end of normalizing any of the mental health work that goes along with this. When I was talking with NCPH folks yesterday, or not NCPH, I'm sorry, National Trust, you made me think of it, Priya, is that one thing the coalition has is we have a standing practice that when we travel and work in hard situations all across the world, that we are working with organization provided mental health professionals afterwards. So yeah, it's a thing we do. Justice beyond criminal justice. Cool. Yes. Thank you, Katie, for that. Right. And that's going to be a thing we're going to start talking about right now, because a lot of this work that we're doing is rooted in some of the definitions and conceptions that we have in our head. Jaime and I, as we were talking about what we wanted to do in this session, we're even just starting to try and play with all the different places and different conceptions that we've heard of with justice, some of which have been written down, some of which haven't, some of which get expressed publicly, some of which don't. And so let's jump in and look at a few definitions just to get ourselves thinking about what might be in our heads. And kind of key as we look at these are thinking about how they define problems and how they start to define solutions, because embedded in each of these is a narrative of how the world is and should be. All right, so let's jump in. Look at some definitions real quick. All right, so we're just going to look at 3 of them. And I know NCPH, we're supposed to footnote everything. So I'm footnoting this one from Wikipedia. There you go. Right, that it's the idea of retributive or punitive justice, right? And this one I felt comfortable footnoting from Wikipedia because it is all around us, right? We live in this all the time. This is the single most common definition of justice that you will run into in the United States, right? So the quote on the screen is a theory of punishment that when an offender breaks the law, justice requires that she or he suffers in return. Right? So when you say, hey, somebody broke the law, they're gonna go to jail, right? Somebody broke the law, they're gonna be fined, right? They're gonna lose a set of their rights. That is punitive or retributive justice, right? That there is some harm that is gonna come to a person that is commensurate with the thing they have done, and that furthers the cause of justice. Okay, so that's definition number 1. Right. And I should say that there are scholars of all of these things that are going to look at these tiny short justice definitions and gnash their teeth and get very angry because they will write chapters and chapters about what these things all mean. So thanks for your forgiveness of the short definitions here. All right, definition number 2, restorative justice. And so restorative justice, there's an image on the screen that has 3 overlapping circles, community, victim, and offender. And it has a triangle linking them as well. And the quote for restorative justice, which comes from the Center for Justice and Reconciliation, says restorative justice is a theory of justice that emphasizes repairing the harm caused by criminal behavior. It is best accomplished through cooperative processes that include all stakeholders. This can lead to transformation of people, relationships, and communities. So restorative justice, probably the most common places that you might see this is in a lot of school systems are starting to think about this, and other places with really defined community sets. It exists elsewhere, right? There's statewide processes for this too, right? But it starts to introduce this idea that it's not just victim, it's not just offender, but there's this larger community, and we're starting to think about the relationships between all of these groups of people, right? And starting to try and make things right means making things right between all those groups of people, right? So it's a little bit more of a complex definition, and it starts to think about the processes of bringing all 3 groups back into alignment, back into balance with each other. Right? If people see definite or see examples of these, or you've worked with examples of these, be adding that into our chats, right? Calling out where those are. Examples that you've seen have worked, examples that you've seen really struggle. All right, so that's definition number 2, right? Restorative justice. And then the third definition that's more of a global definition, but is one that the language of it has started to become much more common in the United States recently, is transitional justice. So this comes from the International Center for Transitional Justice, ICTJ, and they describe transitional justice refers to the ways countries emerging from periods of conflict and repression address large-scale or systemic human rights violations so numerous and so serious that the normal justice system will not be able to provide an adequate response. Transitional justice is rooted in accountability and redress for victims. And I think one of the key ideas here is that a sense of like, hey, our traditional mechanisms have become overwhelmed, right? Whatever we're dealing with is so large and so significant that the mechanisms we normally have set up just don't handle it, right? And it's moved from being something that is at the personal level and is now functioning at the systemic, right? And that's one of the big jumps between transitional justice and restorative or punitive justice, is this idea that, hey, there's not just individuals involved, there are systems involved now. And so trying to make things right is going to mean thinking about people, and it's going to mean thinking about systems. Okay. Transitional justice is started to evolve in a couple of places. You can look to a bunch of the post-dictatorship periods in Latin America for it. One of the most commonly known examples of transitional justice is in South Africa during the post-apartheid period. One of the most recent North American examples that is widely known would be the truth commissions around boarding schools in Canada. Truth commissions are probably the most well-known aspect of transitional justice, but there's a couple of other pillars of it too. So we often talk about there being 5 pillars of transitional justice, right? So this idea of saying, we know society has gotten so out of whack, right, that it's not just people, it's systems. And what do we need to do to start to try and bring us towards a state of more justice, right? So number 1 is truth telling, right? Those truth commissions. Pretty much anywhere you go, when people start talking about justice, they start talking about truth telling. Right? Many of you have been in the United States over the last couple of years. You understand how fraught terms like truth are. And so part of the process of this, I would think of this as very often, this is about processes. Right? Accountability is often both judicial and non-judicial accountability. But this could be either local or international forms of that. Right? So thinking about some judicial accountability, that might be local courts that have a part in this. But if you see, oh, we're at The Hague, we're doing international criminal court, right? That's thinking about this piece too. Memorialization has got to be a part of this. We've got to deal with the mental, emotional, social experiences of what's happened and thinking about how to transform them. Reparations can be both in North America, most commonly talked about as monetary reparations, which are absolutely a part of this, but are not the only form, right? There's also a lot of services that could be given, right, and other kinds of needed resources. And so really thinking about reparations as that kind of equitable resources to try to correct the damages. And the last is institutional reform. Right? So whatever institutions have been contributing to the processes that are causing problems. So whether that's school systems, education systems, employment systems, health systems, security and justice systems, right? How do we change those to better counter this, right? And that can be working at the individual level, my university, right? Or the whole, like, how do we think about healthcare in the United States. So 5 big pillars of this that are critical parts. Right, and we think this is a really helpful way of starting to think about and break into. It's not the only way to understand the world, but it can be hard to figure out where we want to start, identify some of the different threads. And so the transitional justice starts to give us some entry points for thinking about how to work on this. Right? It's also something that is very often with international justice work and any sort of international development work. It's often something that is thought of as needing to happen over there in those other places, in those non-functioning, non-white spaces in the world that need this kind of work. Right? As we think in the United States about systems of harm that have overwhelmed our justice systems, right? Or the justice systems are complicit in, right? Whether that's about race or about colonialism, right? This seems an appropriate potential response in the United States as well. All right. So we're going to pause there for a moment. And we're going to try and go back into some small groups. And we want to give you about 10 minutes to think about what some of these definitions, how they resonate with you, with your work, and where you see potential for your work to start to intersect and follow some of these, right? Which aspects of transitional justice seem most appropriate for you and which not, right? Because nobody's going to lead on all of them. So where are you going to be a leader? Where would you be a supporter? Are there aspects of restorative or punitive justice that seem appropriate to you as well? Okay. And thanks everybody for the comments that have been happening as well. So we're going to open the breakout rooms again, take about, let's see, we'll recreate them. Let's see. All right, we're going to open the rooms again, and we will see you all in about 10 minutes. Yes, we'll add the discussion question to the chat. Right. And for folks who may not be able to join us or just in the feed loop and aren't able to do there, this can be work that you can do quietly by yourself, just sort of have your own reflection. All right, and for folks who are hanging out on feed loop or here in the main room, we are going to be back in about a minute. Thanks for doing the thinking on your own. Right, welcome back, those of you who have started to come back with us. Everybody else will be back in about 30 seconds. Right, 10 more seconds. And as many of you probably know, we're gonna ask, what'd you all talk about? So be prepared for that. Welcome back. All right. Thanks everybody for coming back. What are some of the things that were on your minds when you talked to each other? What came up as you thought about how these definitions of justice might apply in your work? Throw it in the chat box again. If folks want to jump on, happy to hear your voices too. Yeah. Patricia.
Hi.
Yeah, sorry.
Hi, so I work in Tallahassee, Florida at a civil rights museum that was formerly a plantation. So for us, truth telling, the pillar in transitional justice, is what we're emphasizing in our community, is telling the truth about the history of slavery and civil rights in our region, and really having people in our community confront that when they visit us. And so I think that that's something that truth telling is something almost any public historian can engage with, because for us, we're also a state museum. So that means we may not be able to do the advocacy work that comes along with transitional justice because of the way the politics come into play with our institution, but we can most certainly engage in truth telling. And I think that being rooted in empathy and that kind of focus is the most important thing for us here, at least.
Fantastic, thank you. And Katie saying some things that are resonating with that in the chat. Gregory.
There, unmute. Hey, we talked a lot about community engagement and how important that is to any of these projects. I direct the American West Center at the University of Utah. One of the projects we're doing is a National Historic Landmark nomination for the Stewart Indian School in Nevada, near Carson City, Nevada, one of the national boarding schools. And really the driving force behind it is the Nevada Indian Commission, which is a state agency, but the Stewart, the committee that manages the Stewart Indian School there in the commemoration, which is made up of alumni and the descendants of alumni. That school stayed open until 1980. It was one of the last of the boarding schools to close, and went through a lot of different iterations there. So it illustrates this long history there. But I mean, one of the points I think Beth Boland with us made, you know, trust building is really an important part of any of these projects. But the idea that community engagement, community buy-in to these projects is really essential. You know, we're not there to tell our version of their story. And so making sure that that is a step that you take in any kind of project like this, I think, is essential. So that's one of the key things we talked about.
Yeah, great stuff, right? And I'm seeing this, all sorts of great things coming into the chat. right? People talking about the accountability and reparations around roads, and folks talking about the built environment and environmental justice, right? Which, boy, does Jaime have stuff for you in a second, right? And that kind of commentary that somebody had in here, thinking about how sometimes truth-telling might actually be the easiest entry point for us, and that institutional reform seems really hard, right? And maybe that's because of where you are, and that you can move forward truth-telling in a way that somebody who can better move forward institutional reform. But there's also, right, that speaks to that difference between, yeah, it's nice to tell a story, but can we make that jump from the personal to the policy, right? And start to think about making not just personal justice, but that systemic justice, right? Through changes in policy, through changes in institution. Right? And so, yeah, that is a big jump. And without it, you can feel how attempts at institutional justice without the personal storytelling that Gregory's talking about, where we're getting voices in there, right? That feels missing, right? That doesn't work either. And the personal without the institutional doesn't work. And without accountability, it doesn't work, right? We need all of those. We need all of those pieces to help us move forward. Right? One of the things that we'll often talk about here is that we can't expect the outcome. We need our processes to match our desired outcomes. So if we want our desired outcomes to involve transformations of power structures, the processes themselves have to include and be based on those same transformations, right? They have to have those baked in if we want to get a particular outcome. All right, tons more to talk about this, but I live at the theory level a lot, and we wanted to also get much more precise about this too. So Jaime, with like fingers crossed for the internet, let's do it.
Oh, Braden's been helping me. I've had some connectivity issues this morning, so I apologize. He's been carrying and helping me a lot here. So thank you. I've been looking at a lot of the comments. So as I said earlier, I'm the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer over at White Earth, and White Earth is an Ojibwe community. It's one of the largest communities in Minnesota. Some of the economically poorest counties in the state are there. But it's also a very resource-rich area. It's a beautiful, beautiful place. Northern Minnesota is just lovely. And, there's a lot of, oh, here we go. So it's just a wonderful place. It's a beautiful place, and the people are lovely. And so it's not all doom and gloom. That's not how I want to frame this at all. And so a lot of when the reservation first formed, there was a lot of dispossession of various forms. So there was timber that was cut down, there was language loss, children were removed for boarding schools, there were land allotments that kept getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And this is a common experience that's shared by a lot of Indigenous communities and other communities as well, having to find their world getting smaller and smaller. And so that's something that did occur at White Earth. At the same time, there was this belief that Native people were disappearing and they needed to document everything. And so there were a lot of researchers or Indian agents or missionaries, all kinds of folks that kind of passed through and took items or stories or information and didn't bring that back. So people would write books about the community, but the community didn't get a say in the book, or compensation or credit of any kind, or a copy, or anything. And so this is another very common experience for a lot of communities. And so with the preservation work, with folks that are working in archives and museums, or just working for different federal or state agencies, you really are uniquely aligned to do some serious justice work within communities. And so for organizations being able to, in museums, to be able to really ask, how did you get to where you are? What is the origin story for that organization of which you're aligned with or work with? How did items on that museum shelf get there? If you're dealing with paper documents or photographs or sound recordings, what was the context through which those things were accessioned and removed? And so what was happening in the community at the time that those things were created or removed, depending on what it is that you're talking about. And so really doing that internal work before reaching out to a community is key. A lot of times, with my role doing repatriation work, I reach out to museums across the country and I ask for an inventory list of what they may have. And I'm always really specific, saying that I'm not just interested in like a NAGPRA sensitive claim, that I want to know if they have a document. I want to know if they have photographs, because that's part of the community's story. And frequently museums will have to stop and give pause and look at their collections and their with a fresh pair of eyes, I guess. And so doing a little bit of that work first, even if your institution is, located within a predominantly white community, as some folks had commented, what's the information that's within it? Where's that origin? And doing that work and then reaching out to communities is really helpful, because then you're going to have to sit and sort of reassess that work together, right? Reassess those items together. But just having a sense of what you have it's very important. The other piece that I've often found pretty striking in working with different outside agencies is that Indigenous communities and communities of color, we exist in this sort of duality, in the sense that there's a lot of young people that say that they don't really see reflections of themselves around them today in the media or just out and about, right? And there's it's really hard for people to see Indigenous communities and cultures as being alive and thriving, that culture is always changing. And at the same time, there's also this I guess being ill-informed about the historic events of the past, right? Not really having a full concept of that story. And then there's almost this denial that these historic events of the past are influencing the current conditions of communities right now. And so it's this interesting situation of being denied being a living, thriving culture, but also having your historic events, key events that helped shape either the size of your community or the ability to speak your language, or whether grandma talked about what happened to her at school or not. These things are also denied. And so if a lot of those documents, if a lot of the proof of this is held in institutions away from that source community, there's your justice opportunity right there. It's to be able to look at this pile of paper that you might have and see what that could really mean for somebody. And, looking at that together. Let's see, I have to put some notes down here because I had all these technical challenges this morning. So anyway, I also got to thinking about this this quote from a folk singer. I don't know if you've heard of Utah Phillips. He's a pretty cool guy, since passed away, but there was this one quote on a recording that he had done where people kept asking him, why is it that you're always talking about the past, right? And he said this thing where it was like, I could go outside and I could pick up a rock that's older than the oldest song you know, bring it in and drop it on your foot. Like, the past didn't go anywhere. And so I find that when I'm working with Indigenous communities, there's a very real understanding of that. And when you go back out into those institutions that might have their materials, it's like you have to remind people again. But there's a lot of opportunity here. I think one of the biggest challenges that we have now as TIPO officers and tribal archivists and folks at museums or state agencies is that there's this real push to make everything digitized and in public domain, right? And then with communities who didn't get to help shape the content that was written about them, didn't get access to the content once it was removed, and might not have it all back now, to have that consultation sort of skipped as things fall into public domain or become accessible to people with, you know, subscriptions to JSTOR and things like that, right? But not necessarily someone with poor internet connection at the source community. That becomes very challenging. There are certain bits of information that really belong within that community, controlled by that community. And then the community really does have that right to decide what they want to put out there to be accessible to the public, what their story that they want to share is. And so I think that that is a big part of preservation work that really needs to occur right now, is, you know, doing that internal assessment of what you have, having those real conversations with communities that take a long time. This could be years in the making, right? And then deciding together what goes out there and giving those communities, you know, that opportunity to really lead and determine the story that they share. So these are real key conversations that I keep seeing coming up again and again for a lot of communities. The other piece that's really important, I think, to keep in mind is that for a lot of tribes in the US today, we have, you know, historic preservation offices, we have schools, we have tribal colleges, we have cultural centers, museums, we have our own archives. And we also have families that can trace their lineage way, way back. We've got medicine societies, warrior societies that are still active. And so the returning and the sharing of information, it strengthens those societies. And so to this day, you'll see people that have, let's see, I'm just keeping up with the chats here. You'll see people that perhaps have a family member that passes away and decides they want to leave their estate to somebody. So they'll go right to a university or right to, you know, a state historical agency, something like that, right? And they'll forget about the source community. So it just making sure that we're always reminding each other of that is very key. There are two documents that I use a lot in my work. One is a future acquisitions agreement for agencies or museums, archivists, basically saying that if they're approached by somebody with a collection or materials, documents, anything that might be about, say, White Earth, right? That White Earth gets that right of first refusal. White Earth is notified that these things exist. And perhaps White Earth brings that home again so that the community has access to their own information. Or perhaps White Earth gets some kind of digital copy of that, or the museum gets a digital copy and White Earth gets the original documents, and of which case we might enter into a shared stewardship agreement. So the community gets to help dictate how those documents are shared or accessible, or everything's accessible except for this one piece because it deals with funerals and that gets kept private, you know, different situations like that. So a shared stewardship agreement and a future acquisitions agreement are so important if you're going to be doing justice work, because, you know, we're really talking about if cultures are alive and thriving, then there's still going to be documents and things being generated about source communities today, right? We're still going to be writing about natives. We're still going to be talking about what it's like to be Black in America. We're still going to be doing all this. So who owns that information? Where does it go? Does it go back to the community that created it? The community who had to experience this for these documents to be created in the first place? So these are really key pieces to keep in mind, and they're really, really good resources to use. It's right up there with accountability, and it's a real key part of institutional reform, because we don't have to make these grand changes. We could put something down like that in an agreement that shows a good faith effort with the community. And so I can give, in a few minutes here, I can talk a little bit about some of the boarding school work that my office was doing. Hold on here, I'm just checking these. I can share some blank copies, yes. So with the boarding schools, there were College of St. John's and St. Ben's in Minnesota. They are still, they're colleges today, and at one point they operated boarding schools on their current grounds. They also had a residential school on the reservation. And so children either were part of that school on the reservation, or they were removed and brought to the Soder School. And during that time, there were photographs that were taken. There were documents that were written. There were children that passed away and didn't come home. The sisters that worked with these schools as they got towards the end of their careers, or when they had time, you know, they would do interviews about their life, about their experiences, about their work. And there were other researchers and such that had maybe studied. I remember walking into their archives at one point, and I pulled out a document, and it was a study of 150 families on the reservation, unpublished. And so all this information just stayed within these schools, but the community didn't have copies, didn't have access, didn't know that so much material was even in existence. And the folks that are at those institutions now didn't want to upset the people in the community by bringing this back up. And, you know, I mean, just living through COVID for the past year, right? And how many of us are going to want to talk about this when it's all done? Like when COVID is not as serious as it is right now, like if there's a vaccine and we're all good and we fast forward 50 years or 100 years, you know, how many people in the family do you think would want to talk about what it was like, right? So it's a very hard thing, and it's a very sobering thing. And I think that this past year is really really shown just how important it is to do this work, but also the emotional labor involved, as we were discussing, that these things take time. And so the folks at this institution didn't want to upset folks in the tribe. The folks in the tribe knew, obviously, that these boarding schools had existed, but didn't know all the documents and things that were still there. As Chippewa, I get asked all kinds of stuff all the time. I review for pipelines, which we're not in favor of, by the way. And you know, different museums and, you know, all kinds of things. And so at one point, I was contacted by a professor at this institution who wanted to do some kind of library display about the boarding school, acknowledge that it happened, that kind of thing. Wanted to know if I wanted to help design that, which was really cool. It's Professor Gordon, and he's a wonderful guy. And so I went down and I took a look at their archives, and I took a look at some of their images, and I took a look at the space where they wanted to do their library display. And instead of committing to do a full story, like this is what happened, you know, the end, I said that I would help create a library display that acknowledged that this took place and invites people to really come and write that new chapter for what happens next, because that work isn't done yet. And from there, we ended up teaming up, and it's been a couple of years now, and we've all, the sisters and folks at White Earth and myself, and we've all been working pretty closely together about digitizing the documents that are there, about doing truth telling and oral history recording. And there will be time when it's safe where folks from St. John's and St. Ben's, they want to come and they want to be able to apologize to community members, to be able to hear them speak their truth, to be able to have those difficult conversations, more than once, if that's what that requires, right? To be able to share and go through those documents, to be able to digitize those things so they can be taught at the schools at White Earth in a way that fits with the needs of the community and is community-led. At the same time, the Indigenous students that are currently enrolled at that school, they became more aware of that history. And they also became more aware of each other because a lot of students there were feeling kind of isolated. So they've gone off and they've started their own Indigenous students groups. And they've really begun diving into their own histories that way. I've had Indigenous and non-Indigenous students that are enrolled in that college go on and serve as interns with my office, and they've gone and they've helped me document the significance of wild rice by doing oral history recordings with different community members all over so that we can try to list wild rice as a traditional cultural property, because that's a very key and critical food. It's part of how the community migrated to the places in which they did. And it's critical in ceremony, it's very nutritious, it's essential to food security for the people. And so, here we are starting with this library display about residential school history. And we transform into this space where we check in with each other regularly. We're working on massive digitization. We're trying to team up with the tribal college and trying to work with the schools and really have this solid connection. Everything is going to be Indigenous led and White Earth led in that sense. And so it's been a real shift in that relationship, but it's been very strong. There's a lot of work left to do, but the key piece that I've found with working with these folks is that they made the commitment to do this work regardless of whether they had funding to do it or not. They weren't using pending funding and adequate staffing as the qualifier for justice work and for doing the right thing. It might be a little slower, if we don't have as many people available to help. It might take a little longer if we don't have as much funds, offhand, but it's still going to happen. And so I think that's another piece to it as well, is that, a lot of times when I'm in contact with museums or institutions, they say that they would like to help and do more, but funding and staffing. And so here was a situation where they came out on their own and said, this is important to them and they want to work towards this because it's important to the community, so regardless of funding, regardless of staffing. So it's possible to do this work. Like I said, with the students, they've come out and they've really worked with my office. So currently in Minnesota, this wild rice it's very, very fragile and very critical to the health and the well-being of the people, but also the culture. These ceremonies, they include rice, funerals include rice. The migration story for the people includes the rice. So it's a very critical food. And it's deeply, deeply tied to the culture and deeply tied to the spirituality of the people. It's also that area, the Great Lakes area, this is really the largest concentration of wild rice in the country. And so couple that with the fact that this plant is very sensitive. So slight changes in water temperature or level can affect whether that rice grows or not. Sulfates from runoff from the roads, from the salt, that can affect whether the rice grows or not. And so these other issues that we have include pipelines. I don't know, some of you may have seen the Enbridge Line 3 footage that's crossing social media right now. They're literally trying to put a pipeline through wild rice waters and watersheds for tar sands oil that nobody in the community needs. So the struggle is constant, and it's very real. And there's a lot of people working very hard to try to protect this food. But the students and the folks at St. John's and St. Ben's are among them. So it's interesting to start at this place where cultural assimilation was the key. That was the goal for these residential schools, right? And now we're at this place where they are following Indigenous-led initiatives to protect things that matter to the community. And we've done it without the funding, So I wanted to highlight that as one example of something that that I've been working on. Another piece that I've been working on, and it's still something else that's in progress, is I teamed up with NAGPRA Comics, and so we're going to start talking about repatriation stories within White Earth and through the context of the dispossession, what had to happen for an item and information to leave the community in the first place, right? So we're going to tell that in a comic book form, and we're going to do it in a way where we're including the youth as the researchers and the writers and artists to help tell their own story and have that available with different classrooms. From there, what we want to do is be able to do a graphic novel of the creation of this reservation. So all those different policies and things that came into being and how the community experienced all these different levels of dispossession, all those things and qualities that are so wonderful about that area. We're going to really pull that in to a visual medium to be able to be more accessible to the community. One of the things about comic books is that you get to see who it is that's speaking, right? Their face is right there, and you get that voice. And so I want to be able to start pulling this information that's housed all over the world and put it into a story that's directed by the community and accessible to all age levels, so that you have more folks that are really interested in their history and how things came to be and where they fit in that world. We did a lot with just looking at how kids look at comic books and superheroes and what makes someone heroic. What are those qualities that are within a person that would make them fit that profile of a hero? And the more you look at it, the more you start to look at how maybe there's caregivers in a child's life who have those qualities. Maybe grandma has those qualities. And then you start looking at themes within comic books of justice really is a key theme, and what kinds of injustices are going on around you. And so we started really pulling those types of themes together and being able to teach things like treaty and the creation of that reservation, and do it in a way that's really accessible to the kids, because they have a role throughout the whole process. They're going to help in the design and the writing. And so all of these people are coming together to tell that story that, again, is Indigenous led. So these are the types of opportunities that are out there and that aren't necessarily requiring a whole lot of funding to do, but can have really, really, really big impact. I don't know what else to say though, but I just wanted to, I had come up with a bunch of different questions, things to kind of maybe keep in mind as you're going through like some of your own content within your workplace or within your institutions and organizations, and see how you can reach out. I focused a lot of what I was talking about with Indigenous communities because that's kind of my home base here, but it can apply really for all these different communities. You know, there are folks that working at those civil rights museums, and so how engaged are you with those communities that are the source of where those materials came from, right? And those future acquisition agreements and shared stewardship agreements, I'll get those links sent out as well. But those are real key as well, you know, and you could draft that however it is that you want to. You can sit with your organization and try to figure that out in a way that works. And oftentimes that'll change depending on the community that you're working with. So what is really key and critical for White Earth might not be critical for a community that is in Florida or California. But a lot of those themes of public domain and you know, privacy and those ethics for what can stay within a community, a lot of that stuff comes up. And sometimes with Indigenous communities, you know, they might want a physical item cared for in a certain kind of a way. So that kind of stuff can get put in an agreement, because say you have a wonderful relationship with an institution, that's great. But if there's staff turnover, either at the tribal level or at the institutional level, then you'd have to start that over again. So these agreements kind of document what is really working and kind of puts it in a format that if there were that turnover, you can kind of carry on the best of your ability, those same type of relationships and that same kind of standards of care and of accessibility, and they have a way to be able to contact you. So that's a key thing. That's probably one of the most helpful things that I have had in doing this work, and being able to meet different organizations where they're at and have them not feel too overwhelmed with the things that I'm asking of them, right? So we kind of come together and we work at this over a period of months and just have a real solid product when we're done. But, you know, I would encourage people to really, really consider that, because it can go a long way. But thank you so much. I'll turn it back over to Braden.
Amazing stuff, Jaime. Thanks. And so we wanted to leave just a little bit of time here. I see people are talking in the chat box, things that you've done, questions on your mind, things that are coming up. So we just want to leave some time for all of us to talk together here at the end, right? What are paths forward that people are thinking about? What are unresolved questions that you still have? What's resonating with you right now? I love this. People are asking clarification questions of other folks in the chat. Keep it going. Yeah. So at the end here, putting questions in the chat box, opening up mics. What's on folks' minds here at the end of we come to the end of our time together?
I'm trying to move myself so I'm not staring to the side.
Yeah.
The double screen thing. So the thing I really appreciated, Jaime, was how you talked a lot about an institution will often say we don't have funding or we don't have the staff. And I think that is something we'll hear. It's actually really interesting in the last year about how, as organizations have shrunk because of COVID and all that stuff, that people were able to pivot after the events of last year to actually focus in on social justice work in a way that they've never done before, despite having low funding and despite having less staff. And I don't know if this is a question and more of a comment, but I think that illustrates how those are false excuses. Even though we do know, as we also have labor conversations, is that there's also that challenge on the side as well, is that as we shrink and as we get smaller, what is being asked of staff is more. And so it's not contradictory, but it is a challenge, I think, that we're going to have to grapple with after we come out of this pandemic.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, even for me, I feel overwhelmed sometimes because I do all the Section 106 reviews for within the reservation and outside of the reservation for the entire migration. So if somebody wanting to put up a grain bin somewhere in, Ohio, I review that, plus all the pipeline stuff, all, water quality things, traditional cultural properties. I manage all of the tribal archives, seek out more archives, try to document what's going on now, like things with COVID and all of this, and do all the repatriation work as well. So it's a lot to put on any one person. So I'm sensitive to that. People are asking about best ways to really, approach communities. If you're talking about indigenous communities within the United States, one of the best things you could do if you're looking at cultural things, historic things, is to really try to connect with the Tribal Historic Preservation Office and see if they can kind of connect you that way. Another thing that you could try to do is reach out to a tribal college. Maybe there's a professor there that's works on teaching that history, and they can connect you to who it is that's within the tribal administration that's doing that work right now. Reaching out to tribal councils and administrations also is a good way to be able to do that. A lot of these tribes, they've got websites. They might not always be completely up to date, especially with COVID and all the shutdowns and such. But, a lot of times people forget to kind of just check that stuff too, Sometimes tribes even have Facebook pages and such. You could just drop a note in there and say, hey, I'm trying to reach so-and-so. But I would really try to officially reach out. If you're from an institution, representing an institution, I would try to reach out to the historic preservation officers or the tribal leadership, and then if you don't hear anything back, I'd try again, because that was one thing that happened in the 90s when NAGPRA came about, and all these museums sent out these letters all at once, to different communities, and they may not have heard back. Might be because that community only has one person and they were really swamped and they didn't get to it, so you keep trying, and then try to reach out to other people, in the administration and such. So that's a good way to do it. It does take time, like I was saying. But yeah, for me, it was really helpful when these, former residential schools reached out and said, regardless of whether they get funding opportunities or not, this is important. So it meant a lot, and that went a long way,
Yeah, I think the attitude change is important. Like, don't go in saying we have these barriers. Go in and say, how can we work with you or for you to do this work? Yeah.
Another piece to maybe add in there is that while Jamie's talked a lot about how we need to be shifting power, right, and having Indigenous-led activities, that doesn't mean there's not work that institutions can be doing by themselves prior to that, so that when you have that outreach, right, you have a pretty good sense that your institution is ready to start walking down that path and willing to, rather than, as Jamie said, hey, folks have got really limited time, showing up, asking people to start things, and then kind of breaking the momentum of what you're doing can often put you even just further behind, right? Because you're not able to keep promises, you're not able to follow through on work. So there is work, that hard internal work, not looking for somebody else to lead the hard conversation for your institution, but trying to have that yourself to get things started so that people are receptive is an important part of this too. Right? And I think that timeframes that people are talking about matter as well. We're talking about trying to unwind 400 plus years of colonial history. That means this is multi-generational work that we're all engaged in. Right? And that means there's things we can do every day, but that sense of how long things should take, right? We can, just as Jaime was saying, like, we can get wins tomorrow. right, with protecting wild rice, protecting artifacts and getting stuff repatriated. And if you missed it in there, line 3, pipeline, it's a real thing right now, right? You want to get started? Help stop that. But we're also thinking about that as right, this is multi-generational work. Jim, I see you keep trying to jump in.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to echo that conversation about, just making the time to do the work. I think so. I work for a local preservation office in Colorado, and we're trying to dive into the social equity work, and of course, capacity is a real issue. But how we've been trying to frame that is that this should be a core function. It's often treated as that extra thing that we'll get to. We'll see if we can squeeze some funding out of something or ask city council for extra funding. That's a common thing to think of this as an extra. But we've been having an internal conversation about just saying this should be a core function. This should be part of the core function of our office. So let's actually evaluate what else we're doing that isn't actually as high priority. Stop or reduce our level of service on that so that we can put social equity front and center and social justice front and center, so that we don't feel like we're trying to squeeze it in with our extra staff time or things like that. So that might be a suggestion for other institutions that are preparing for this work, is reassess the other stuff that maybe is currently a core function that shouldn't be, and you can set that aside to make space for social justice work that should be a priority.
Institutional reform takes a lot of different shapes, right? And what you're talking about there is one version of that, right? It's not just who's on our advisory committee, though that matters, right? But it's starting to say, what's our mission? What's our goal? How do we define ourselves? How do we shift that, right? What do we consider those core functions? Right? And starting to do that and say, actually, as we often talk about with coalition members, right, our cultural organizations exist to care for the health of our society, right? They exist to do this. And so understanding that as a function of what we do, the main thrust of it. Yeah. All right, Jaime put her email in there. I'll drop mine in a second so that we can keep this conversation going. I'd encourage you, if you hear other people who you want to talk to as well, you can send direct messages in Zoom, right? Do so politely and thoughtfully and tactfully, asking permission and to connect with somebody or offering your email. But use this as an opportunity to connect with others who you want to do that with. Go ahead, Jaime, you were going to say something.
I was just saying that I'm trying to pull up my reception is so slow right now. I apologize. So I'm trying to pull up those links. If I don't get them posted here in the chat before we end, I put my email in so I can get you those. I can get you those documents if you're interested in them, if I don't get a chance to upload this in time. Thank you.
Last couple moments, any last things that people want to ask or say or share or connect around? Just another minute or two together. There's a question about any suggestions for those working within the constraints of government, hoping to push forward change from within. Oh, what a good question. And it sounds like there's been a couple of people on either governmental or semi-governmental organizations already commenting on that. Jaime, do you have anything that you've seen, best ways you've seen people be allies within governmental organizations?
Just to be able to support a lot of those initiatives that are going on within the community. And it doesn't have to be a big thing. I have folks that are within Interior or the Park Service that have been very supportive of smaller projects that I've been working on. And so that is a good opportunity to work on something together. It turns out great. They can then go back to the powers that be and say, hey, look at this thing that we did that turned out great. this is the next thing that they want to do, and you kind of, you start from wherever you can, and you just keep kind of building up. There'll be times where that thing that you really want to do, maybe there's resistance, but is there anything you can do kind of leading up to that so that you can be successful and then challenge that next step? The other thing too is that, sometimes it's just not the right time for something because of certain people that are in certain positions. And so you nourish all those other relationships that you can, you nurture those, and then you reapproach when you can. There's other opportunities where you can challenge it directly, especially if you're talking within an Indigenous community. I mean, that community as a sovereign nation can put forth a request that can make an administration pause. A lot of Indigenous communities now are working in solidarity with Black and Brown communities elsewhere, and joining up and asking those same types of requests together, especially after the events of this past summer. So there's opportunities for solidarity, I guess, between communities, and then there's different ways. You got to find your helpers within those institutions and see who they might be able to point you in the direction of. It takes time, but it's possible. Definitely possible.
The work public history work like this is nonviolent social change work. Right? We are trying to build a different world. So use the same tools we use in the rest of our nonviolent social change. Right? Find your people, build your relationships, find your power with other people, and make change out of that. Right? You find your people, and you'll find your power, and together you can do this. Right? And that's yeah. All right. I see there's more chats coming in, but we are for today at the end of our time. So we're going to pause right here because this work is never done. It's all about some of the pauses that we'll take from time to time. Both of us are really appreciative of getting to spend time. You gave us a chance to talk about this together and then get to share it with you all. And of all the thoughts, energy you've put in the past that you brought here today, and then what you're going to do with this in the future. So we look forward to seeing you all many times in the days ahead as we all try and move forward with this. So thanks again so much for coming today, and we look forward to what we'll do together in the future.
Thank you so much. Feel free to reach out. I really do mean that. I'm willing to work with anybody and sit with anyone and see how to move forward. So feel free. Always. Thank you.
Bye all.